Something odd happened in 2022. The next edition of the Sight and Sound poll came out, and gone was Vertigo from the #1 spot. Citizen Kane, the previous greatest film of all time holder for 50 years, didn't even take back its spot. Instead, the critics chose Jeanne Dielman, 23 Quai du Commerce, 1080 Bruxelles. If you have been into films for a minute, and especially in the circles of physical media, specifically the Criterion Collection, you've probably heard of this movie and its reputation. It's slow, boring, and beloved. I remember my first encounter with the concept of this film and other boring films, and I couldn't help but feel drawn to the word pretentious. After all, aren't movies about stories? Aren't we supposed to enjoy watching them? Now, several years later, I can call myself a little bit of a slow film fanatic. Or maybe disciple is the better term, since I seek to implement its principles in my own work. Circling back to the Sight and Sound poll, I distinctly remember letting out a little yell of happy validation at seeing Jeanne Dielman topping the list. Sure, the critics don't represent the general populace, but artistically, I feel they generally get there a little after the avant-garde, acting as a bridge or filter into the mainstream. Someone eating a potato for 3 minutes unironically will probably never be mainstream, but the pauses, loose narrative structure, and focus on experience may. But before we get to what exactly we can learn from slow cinema and why I consider it to be the future, we have to define what exactly it is, or at least attempt to bring all these disparate films from many different cultures together. All good definitions start with at least a little history, and if you would like to take a little overview of slow cinema beyond the simple Google search, I would recommend reading the new introduction to Transcendental Style in Film by Paul Schrader that is entitled Rethinking Transcendental Style. I use it to check my own genealogical history in this section, and I will be using it as a primary tool for cataloging the stylistic elements later. So where does it all begin? In some way, we could probably trace the beginnings of slow cinema all the way to the very first movies and the simple pleasure they offered of viewing projected reality. There was no need for narrative here. Seeing was enough. Of course, for anything to be truly recognized or take shape, someone must form it into something recognizable. This is where André Bazin yet again enters the scene. Bazin was a film critic and founder of Cahiers du Cinéma, the journal that spawned the likes of Godard and Truffaut, helped establish auteur theory, and all sorts of other important stuff. Yet perhaps his most singular or personal gift to film was through his own writings, many of which are collected in What is Cinema Volumes 1 and 2. In these 2 volumes, Bazin discusses and molds a large variety of ideas, the most important of which is the reality of the image. To greatly simplify and reduce the greatness and complexity of Bazin's thought on the topic, he believed that what made cinema special was its ability to crystallize reality, to capture the little moments rather than be forced to reconstruct them. The next step after Bazin was taken by Deleuze in his book Cinema 2, The Time Image. The key difference between the 2 philosophers' ideas is perfectly encapsulated by their thoughts on Umberto D, and in particular the scene in which a young maid fails to light a match immediately. Paul Schrader uses this small moment to summarize their position when he writes, "Where Bazin emphasized the scene's realism, Deleuze focused on its use of time." To me, this is less of a difference and more of a refinement, because reality itself plays out over time. The implications of Deleuze's refinement, though, is that narrative is now secondary to being. Between Bazin and Deleuze, there is one other text that needs to be mentioned, and that is Paul Schrader's own work entitled Transcendental Style in Film, which I already mentioned above. The reason that I don't hold this to quite the same level as these two is that it was more focused in on a specific, universally spiritual style and its implications. It still has a lot of connections and discussions of slow cinema, but it is much more focused and less broadly impactful. These 4 works, What is Cinema Volumes 1 and 2, Transcendental Style in Film, and Cinema 2, The Time Image, are core texts of slow cinema and film theory at large. But by the time Cinema 2 actually came out in 1985, Jeanne Dielman was 10 years old already. So once again, Deleuze was merely categorizing and bringing together what he saw. After him, there are of course many other authors and writers to discuss this movement away from narrative and to existence or being, but none have had as big of an impact. Today, we instead have films for our primary guides. From the classics of Robert Bresson to the bleak challenges of Belle Étard and the ongoing work of Scott Barley, slow cinema is alive and well, even if it seems to be merely napping in its own corner. Now that we know its ancestry, we can turn to its actual elements and how to spot a slow cinema movie. Most discussions focus primarily on shot length, as that is the most obvious and connecting element, but Paul Schrader offers up the most complete list to my knowledge. His list consists of 12 traits, which interestingly does not include shot length, because it is a byproduct of other choices, not the governing rule. So let's look at what he identifies. First, wide angles. Schrader notes how most slow cinema films prefer tableaus. Wide shots allow the audience to take in the frame, its characters, and all their details, rather than being carefully directed. Second, static frame. aka there is minimal camera movement because it would distract the viewer and their gaze. Third, minimal coverage. All those little insert shots, reverse angles, etc. are all gone in favor of staging, framing, and length of shot. Fourth, offset edits. Characters can enter the frame late and leave early, letting the shot linger without their presence. This begs the question, what is the real story or the real focus? Fifth, images preferred over dialogue. I'll actually come back to this one in a minute. Sixth, highly selective composed music, if any. Diegetic, or music from within the film's world, is king in slow cinema, because once again, music is a controlling device. Seventh, heightened sound effects. Schrader sees this as a way to heighten and highlight the everyday. Eighth, a visual flatness, or in other terms, a de-emphasis of dramatic framing or specific highlighting. Even camera movement here most often occurs at 90-degree angles. Ninth, repeated compositions. Shots framed the same way or very similarly are often repeated. Once again, if shots are the same, they all have the same value. Schrader points out that this sets context in greater relief. 10th, doubling, or the repetition of information. 11th, non-acting, barely moving. 11th, non-acting, barely moving. Once again, the emotion is stripped from the characters and story and placed somewhere else. And finally, number 12, color and screen ratio. Many slow cinema films are in black and white or desaturated or have some other type of restrictive element to the frame. On the one hand, what ties this list together is an effort to distance the audience by providing them with as few of the usual distractions as possible. No fancy colors, acting, movement, or music. But to me, the most important element that lies beneath all of this can be found in the fifth observation. Images preferred over dialogue, which I would change to images preferred over everything. Each of the elements of the above list all stem from the root belief in the power of the unadulterated image, the image left to speak for itself, or more precisely, the image left for us to find a voice in. I hinted at it a few times above, but if the emotion and focus aren't directly guided by the screen and the elements it contains, then what are they guided by? From my perspective, we are the guides. Without our interest, our gaze, our hearts, and our minds, the film offers nothing. It is only by giving oneself over to time, to the little moments, that the film becomes alive. The viewer is as much a part of a slow cinema film as is any character. And if you want an excellent example of this, I would point to Sleep Has Her House by Scott Barley, and one shot in particular, in which an owl looks directly into camera, as if acknowledging us and our vision. So why is slow cinema the future? On a fundamental level, what connects such disparate films as 2001: A Space Odyssey and An Elephant Sitting Still is full faith in the image. To be more precise, these films possess full faith in the form itself, in film's unique ability to capture reality despite our efforts to mold and change it. Where the average film becomes concerned about the audience's ability to understand it and thereby begins to control or direct our every look and emotion, slow cinema releases as much control as possible. What I'm getting at here is that a style, genre, or loose collective that focuses attentively on film's simplest element and explores it will naturally distill and discover essential elements and new ways of expression. So far, slow cinema practitioners have shown the essentialness of reality, the power of pauses, the unimportance of narrative, and the fakery that comes from dictating too much. If you think for a minute about recent successful films, you can probably find a few of these elements, just probably not all of them. In fact, when I was pitching this idea to a friend, they pointed to No Country for Old Men as a movie that adopts many of these slower aesthetics to great effect. And I bet you yourself can think of many more. So essentially, what makes slow cinema the future is its insistence on discovering and exploring what makes film special, its duration and inherent reality, not its narrative, acting, music, etc. All these are only expressions or extra add-ons. On a slightly deeper and more broad level, we can see the extremity of slow cinema as providing a balance to the hyper-reality we now live in and are constantly assaulted with. When we are constantly told to move, to go, to achieve, slow cinema says to sit, wait, and observe. To me, these films' greatest strength lies in their ability to encapsulate being. Of course, this has to do with the long take and time, but their framing, acting, everything begs us to re-recognize the world around us and the people that inhabit it. Practically every time I finish a slow movie, I feel and see anew. The breeze, the sun, the carpet, all hold new textures and capture light in new ways. People become so independent, so lovely, so in need of care and compassion. In this way, I see slow cinema as not only a search for a form's essential elements, but also for our humanity in an age that works to make us forget. Slow cinema is ultimately a call to remember. So, if I've piqued your interest, I would like to offer up 3 films with which to begin your slow cinema journey. First, whether you've seen it or not, I would like to urge you to watch 2001: A Space Odyssey with slow cinema in mind. In my eyes, it is the perfect gateway because it's just enough of what we expect from a movie without sacrificing a more contemplative, image-forward perspective. Secondly, I would watch Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker. It is much more interested in time, atmosphere, and thought. It still has the semblance of a narrative, but spends much more time in waiting, which is perfect because it leaves you with a lot to chew on. Not to mention, Tarkovsky is the father of slow cinema, so you'll get to watch the master at work. If you survive, or maybe even enjoy these 2, my final recommendation is Sleep Has Her House, directed by Scott Barley. All narrative is gone now, only scraps are left. Instead, we receive the might of nature and our own smallness in full force. It is an experience first and foremost, focused entirely on our own being, our perception, and our fears. If you reach this film and love it, then I think it's safe to say, welcome to the team. If Sleep Has Her House is a little too much for you, that's fine. It is a lot. But hopefully you found a happy medium and can continue to explore cinema in its rawest and most basic form. I hope in slow cinema you can find what makes movies special and a reminder of the beauty and power of the world and the people around you. To forget is a terrible thing, but to remember is the greatest gift.